For more stories like these, go to www.social-tv.co.za, subscribe to us on YouTube, and follow us on our social mediums.
So thank you, Dr. David Harrison. Just very quickly, on the 17th, the president talked about the abuse of alcohol. And then in an unprecedented move, as the DG Murray Trust, alongside the members of the board of the Western Cape Liquor Authority, the South African Medical Research Council, and the UCT School of Public Health, you guys then came together and developed a set of measures that you urged government to kind of consider and to put in place. Doctor, just talk us through those measures and the discussions.
So, I mean, in many ways, the lockdown was a natural experiment. It allowed us to see things in society that perhaps we'd been blind to before. And one of the things we saw was that the lockdown resulted in a very sharp decline in all sorts of crimes, in murders, in robberies, but also in crimes against women and crimes against children. So we saw a sharp decline in gender-based violence. We saw a sharp decline in femicides during that period. And of course, the question was this due to the lockdown or was it due to the ban in alcohol? And the interesting thing was that in many other countries where they've had a lockdown, but they haven't had a ban on alcohol, you actually saw an increase in rates of domestic violence and gender-based violence. In other words, people locked up in their homes and men and women together for longer time than usual resulted in an increase in gender-based violence. But that wasn't the case in South Africa. In fact, what we saw is that with the ban on alcohol, we actually saw a dramatic decline in violence against women and children. And so that was a strong pointer that, in fact, alcohol is a major aggravator of gender-based violence and that we have to do something about it. Now, let's just be clear that gender-based violence is not just about alcohol. It's about the way that men think and behave towards women. But we do know that gender-based violence is made worse by policing and justice systems that don't work, but also by excessive alcohol consumption, binge drinking. And so when the president acknowledged the fact that there was so much gender-based violence and that there had been this decline and that perhaps was now the time for more drastic steps to address alcohol abuse in South Africa, then we immediately stepped in and said, well, actually, it's not drastic steps that are needed. It's very reasonable, sensible steps that the World Health Organization says needs to be put in place in order to reduce binge drinking, in order to reduce the abuse of alcohol, not social drinking, but the abuse of alcohol. And so we immediately responded by getting together and saying, these are the big 5 steps that need to be put in place to significantly reduce the abuse of alcohol in South Africa, and in doing so, believe that it will make a big dent in terms of gender-based violence.
Doctor, we'll get into those 5 steps. I just want to quickly talk about this idea of binge drinking. Why do South Africans binge drink at an alarming level? And it's not even social drinking, that they'll go for 5 days not drinking, and then when they start drinking, they can't stop.
Yes, that's right. And it may be good to just define binge drinking. And so binge drinking is having sort of more than 5 drinks in any one day. And there's a very, very strong association between binge drinking, gender-based violence, traffic accidents, homicides, all sorts of assault. So when we have a look at the rates of binge drinking in South Africa, we see that among drinkers, between 50 and 60% of people in South Africa who drink actually binge drink. Now, I mean, this is a real problem. It's one of the highest rates across the world. And I have no doubt that to a large extent, it's due to socioeconomic marginalization in South Africa, where people don't have opportunity, they don't have recreation over weekends, and so sort of abuse of alcohol almost becomes a form of recreation. It becomes normal in communities for people to be drunk from Thursday through to Sunday. And so addressing issues of alcohol in South Africa also mean that we have to address socioeconomic factors that drive people to feel excluded. That's crucial, but we also know that, people also have their own free will. They can also respond to life circumstances in different ways. And so we believe that it's really important to work with binge drinkers and to be able to point out and to be able to create incentives for them that they do not abuse alcohol and that they can actually improve their own lives.
Doctor, is a binge drinker an alcoholic?
No, not necessarily at all. And this is the interesting thing: is we're actually talking about, an alcoholic is dependent on alcohol and absolutely craves it every single day and needs it before breakfast. Whereas a binge drinker typically, as you say, can go for 3 or 4 days without drinking at all. And then when they do drink with their friends, typically on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, will drink a huge amount at any one time. And unfortunately, that's become almost like socially acceptable in our communities. And it's sad to see, when people almost sort of laugh off the fact that people are inebriated to that extent. That's binge drinking, and it is something that can be changed. Whereas alcohol dependence is very, very slow. It requires a huge amount of therapy and support. But as a society, we can reduce the prevalence of binge drinking far quicker.
Doctor, could you maybe articulate why South Africans struggle with alcohol and even having a decent conversation about alcohol? Because there are places in the world where you literally walk every 5 meters, there's a pub, like in Ireland, for example. You'll see a pub every 5 meters. If you go into Dubai, it's really difficult to find a liquor store. And yet these societies, these communities have learned to talk about or communicate about alcohol in a more relaxed manner. Where in South Africa, it's a very emotive conversation. I've heard after the president's speech, people automatically start talking about the knock-on effect on the economy. We can't seem to have the alcohol conversation in a clear, cohesive manner that doesn't derail into the negative space.
Yeah, I think you put the nail on the head. Yeah, and very much sort of sharing your frustration. I think the first thing is we need to understand that actually only 40% of South Africans drink alcohol. So there's a large percentage of South Africans who don't. But those who do drink exceptionally heavily. In terms of actual numbers, about of those people who do, an average of 27 liters of pure alcohol a year. Obviously in the drinks, but 27 liters of pure alcohol a year does a huge amount of damage to not only society but to your body as well, your liver and other organs. And so it is very, very strange why there's not this willingness to talk about it. I think there are a number of reasons. I think firstly, the history of alcohol in South Africa is very much linked to the apartheid system. If we think about the DOP system in South Africa, if we think about the channeling of beer into townships in huge quantities, that was sort of accepted as the norm and as a way of, in a way, sort of subduing or keeping people, quote unquote, happy through the apartheid era. So we need to understand that alcohol, in a way, was an instrument of suppression in South Africa, and unfortunately, that continues to play itself out. So I think there's that dimension that it's almost sort of there's almost shame in communities, and as I say, that has become embedded in the psyche of communities that feel marginalized, who feel, in a way, humiliated and downtrodden. It really just continues to be part of that psyche. But then I think there's the other side, which is where social drinkers who are not binge drinkers somehow are not able to confront the harm that alcohol does in South Africa, because they feel that in doing so, it's a reflection on them and their behavior. And, I mean, I happen not to drink, but I have absolute respect for people who choose to drink alcohol in moderation. That's their right. I don't have a problem with that. But I do expect them to be able to join with me in understanding the harm that alcohol does in our society, understanding the benefits that the industry brings in terms of the economy, but ensuring that the cost of the harms do not outweigh the economic benefits that it brings to our society. And so for me, I think there's a clear cost-benefit argument that needs to be made, and people need to be able to deal with their own personal decisions about alcohol, put that aside, and objectively say, is this industry costing our country more than it's actually contributing? And that discussion has not properly had. And clearly, the industry is very keen that the South African public does not have that conversation.
Doctor, is there a healthy relationship with alcohol? And I want to contextualize it. We know Americans are gun crazy. And the moment you talk about gun safety at schools, they try and separate the two issues around a person who is mentally unstable having access, or the mechanisms around how that person accessed a firearm. And then they'll quite easily state it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people. Do we suffer from that exact syndrome in South Africa when it comes to that debate around alcohol? We've seen over the last 10, 15 years a massive increase in gender-based violence, and yet they will choose to debate that conversation around the things that struck a chord with them, that's important to them.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that, alcohol is very polarizing in society. Often people who are on the receiving end of harm don't want to talk about it because they are often battered women and children, and it's very difficult to talk about. Or as men, they're ashamed of their behavior. But I do think that there's a bravado. There's a false bravado in South Africa, which is that men particularly can hold their liquor, and there's almost an expectation that if you're a real man, you will drink. That's an expectation, and that you will drink a lot, and that in drinking a lot, you will somehow be able to hold your liquor. We know that doesn't happen. We know that what ultimately happens is that groups of men sitting in a tavern together ultimately get so inebriated that their sense of bravado disappears, and their sense of inadequacy and their underlying aggression often that is the result of humiliation and a sense of not having a job. All of those issues come to the surface, and then they go home and take it out on their wife.
Doc, I will admit, when I read these 5 potential measures, ideas that government could implement, I thought they were cleverly constructed. It wasn't calling for a ban on alcohol. In actual fact, it was asking us to really think about how we advertise, how we reduce the availability of alcohol. As a non-drinker, it could have been easy to say, let's ban alcohol, but what I love about these 5 measures are that they're realistic and they fit within the construct of a South Africa that, as you say, a large 40% of us are binge drinkers.
Yeah, that's right. And we know that bans on alcohol don't work. The US tried it in the 1920s, prohibition, and we know that it resulted in illicit brewing and massive bootlegging of alcohol, as it's called, illegal trade of alcohol. So that's not the way to go. We also have to acknowledge that the alcohol industry does play an important role in the South African economy. And thirdly, we have to respect the rights of individuals to choose to drink and not to drink. And it's not up to, I don't believe that it's up to the state to try and place those sort of extreme bans. But what we can do is try and put in place measures, firstly, that ensure that there is a clear understanding of the risk of alcohol, that the costs of alcohol are borne by the industry or borne by drinkers and not borne by non-drinkers. And for me, this is really, really important, is that at the moment, the industry is taking all the profits, and it's the battered women and children who are bearing all the costs. These are interventions that the World Health Organization, looking at countries across the world, has said, if you put them in place together, you will significantly reduce abuse of alcohol, the excessive drinking of alcohol. And so these were the five. I mean, firstly, a ban on alcohol advertising, in the same way that we have a ban on tobacco advertising, except at the sites of sale and where it's not visible to children under the age of 18. And you can say, well, that's not really fair, but we know that young people are incredibly influenced by the type of alcohol advertising that there is in South Africa. And the patterns of drinking are established in 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. So banning the advertising of alcohol is a very, very important strategy, and it's been shown to be the world over. The second strategy is to ensure, as I said, the costs of alcohol are actually borne by the drinker or by the industry, and that means that we have to increase the price of alcohol. At the moment, the costs of alcohol far outweigh the benefits. And, there are two ways of increasing the price of alcohol. One is through what are known as excise taxes. And the interesting thing is that unlike smoking, excise taxes on alcohol in South Africa are lower today than they were in the 1960s and 1970s. So we have to, so basically what's happening is that the real cost of alcohol in terms of excise taxes has become cheaper and cheaper over the years. We're going in the wrong direction, and so we have to increase excise taxes. But equally, and perhaps even more importantly, a huge percentage, about 80% of wine, for example, in South Africa, is sold for less than about 20 Rand a bottle. So there's a dual economy here, a big markup of wine that goes into retailers and exported. And then for that which can't be sold, it's white labeled and it's sold off into poorer communities at 20 Rand a bottle. And so we have to introduce a minimum unit price for a unit of alcohol in South Africa as a way of ensuring that there's not dumping of cheap liquor onto poorer communities that we know results in binge drinking. The third thing we need to do is to reduce the legal limit for drunk driving. We know that at a limit of about 0.02% of alcohol in your blood, in other words, 1 part of alcohol to every 5,000 parts of blood, you start to have signs of intoxication. You start to not be able to perform as well as you did. Now, at the moment, our legal limit is 0.05, which actually means that people are driving in a compromised way, in a way in which they're neurologically compromised. And so reducing it to 0.02% is going to reduce the number of traffic accidents we have in South Africa. Those are three very important ones, but we mustn't forget that, that alcohol is very, very available in our communities. I don't have to tell you, you can get it sort of almost day and night. And so putting in place restrictions on trading hours so that it's not as available, restricting the size of the container, so we don't have 1 liter of beer containers and 5-liter box containers of wine, and reducing the density of legal shebeens and taverns, especially in residential areas, is absolutely crucial. And it's obviously not only the policy that needs to be in place, but the enforcement as well. And then finally, as we spoke about, there are people who are dependent on alcohol who need support. And we have a very poor system of counseling and therapy for alcohol-dependent people, for addicts. And so we have to improve those. So those are the five: advertising, reduction in price, reduction in the legal limit for drinking, reduction in availability, and providing help for people those that need it. And if we do that, it's going to reduce both gender-based violence, but it's also going to reduce crime, homicides, traffic accidents, and other forms of illness in South Africa. It's a win-win if our concern is developing a healthy society.
Doc, final question. The signatories, as I mentioned at the beginning of our interview, includes the South African Medical Research Council, your organization that's been around for quite a while, members of the board of the Western Cape Liquor Authority, and also, of course, the UCT School of Public Health. You've now put these measures together Is government listening? Are you having the right conversations at the moment?
So we immediately follow that up with formal letters that we sent through to the president, to the ministers, to the parliamentarians, speakers of parliament, and in fact, that letter was subsequently signed by a further about 180 researchers and academics who are working in this field through sociology or through health or through other areas, all of whom are getting in and supporting it. So we've written to the politicians, we've written to the president. All of those signatories have offered to help, to put in place the policies and to put in place the practical measures to reduce binge drinking in South Africa. So we will be following it up. We haven't yet had formal responses from the president or the ministers. We understand that this is an incredibly busy time for everybody, but this is an issue that will continue beyond COVID. In many ways, COVID has really exposed the extent of the harm that alcohol causes. And in fact, we're not going to get beyond COVID, and we're certainly not going to get beyond gender-based violence if we don't take this issue up. And so for us, it's an imperative and something that we're not going to let go.
Dr. David Harrison, thank you very much for your time and articulating somebody who consumes alcohol. I am completely on board with these 5 steps, and I think if we could do it in COVID under lockdown, we can certainly do it in a much wider concern and with much more thought behind it.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Have a good one. That's Dr. David Harrison, who is the CEO of the D.G. Murray Trust, talking to us about a suggestion that was put together in conjunction with the South African Medical Research Council, the UCT School of Public Health, and members of the board of the Western Cape Liquor Authority on how we can work and develop strategies to affect especially gender-based violence that's caused through excessive alcohol consumption.